Hey guys, Liam here, how's it going? Now, this video is going to be an interesting one because it might ruffle a few feathers for a subset of the Linux gaming community, because Payday 2 is the latest to remove native Linux support, which now brings a big discussion on the future of gaming here. Now, this news overall affects the Steam Deck directly as well, since the Steam Deck out of the box runs SteamOS Linux. To briefly set the scene here, Payday 2 came to Linux officially back in 2016 with a native port. So what I mean by that is the developers made a version specifically to run on Linux, just like they would for their Windows version or consoles. What they've now done is remove support for it. It will no longer be getting any updates, and players using the native Linux build will no longer be able to matchmake with other players across the board. Now, this is going to always be a problem for a platform that is a niche. When you look at it overall, Steam, Desktop Linux, and Steam Deck together only make up about 1.47% of the overall user base, with 96% being on Windows and the rest on Mac. When you look at that on face value, does it really make sense for developers to spend their time specifically building for and supporting a dedicated Linux build for Steam Deck and desktop when that time could be spent elsewhere? Now, the reality is, and keep in mind, this is coming from me, someone who has spent now 14 years covering Linux gaming on my main gamingonlinux.com website, it really doesn't make any sense for the vast majority of game developers. Now, there is a rather vocal minority element of the Linux community that parrots this no tucks, no bucks mantra. And for those that don't understand, tux is basically the logo for Linux. And as if that's really going to do anything, saying they won't buy a game unless it does have a native Linux build. And most developers will just go on to simply say, oh no, anyway, and then just carry on selling to that 96% and live happily ever after and not care about Linux. As we've seen here clearly with Payday 2 and numerous other titles in the past, it simply doesn't matter in the end if a game does have native Linux support. Developers barely earn much from it, and eventually they may just entirely drop it like this, and Rust and Rocket League, and the list goes on. Not just that, but a fair amount of native Linux games do eventually break when developers stop updating them. And as we've also seen in the past, plenty of native Linux versions don't even have cross-platform multiplayer even with Windows, so you end up massively limited on who you can actually play with. Or they have patches that are multiple weeks and months delayed. This is ultimately why Valve decided to fork Wine and turn it into Proton, along with funding various other projects in the open source community like DXVK and VKD3D Proton to get direct 3D to Vulkan translation into a place where it performs well, and for the most part it does. Not only does Proton enable thousands of Windows games to just run out of the box, but Valve can make game-specific fixes to keep compatibility going on pretty much forever. And since it's open source, anyone can, if they have the knowledge and desire, go and fix a game in Proton. And you have to remember, the vast majority of games that you play on the likes of Steam are all closed source proprietary with various middleware that are all closed source as well. Does it truly matter if that is natively built for Linux when you could use a fully open source translation layer to run it? For developers, it's ideal. They can work on one main version of the game that targets Windows APIs, and Proton then enables it to run on Steam Deck and desktop Linux. Game developers can, of course, look to support their game in Proton directly by using it as a testing environment themselves. They could even use the Vulkan API directly instead of Direct3D, because Vulkan is cross-platform and works on Windows as well. And if developers then use Vulkan directly on Windows, it would help remove some of the potential overhead from DXVK and VKD3D Proton, since it would just use Vulkan directly on Linux as well. And with Proton, if the Linux kernel or the user space software in Linux changes something, Proton can just get updated to work around it and then continue to allow multiple tens of thousands of games just to continue working, and it would be invisible to players. Whereas with native games, all those individual developers have to go back and fix things individually. All that said, I wouldn't discourage a developer from doing a native Linux version. Just because a bunch of bigger developers decided to drop support doesn't make it wrong to do it, and there's numerous reasons why a native port could be better, and the game developer would then just have the ultimate control over every bit of their game and where it is, rather than relying on a compatibility layer. And I should say, I've got thousands of games in my Steam library that do have native Linux support, and they work fine. But my point is really that we should be looking towards supported games, regardless of what tech is actually making it run. As long as the game developer is ensuring the quality of the game and fixing up problems, then that's what really matters, doesn't it? Valve knew that the Steam Deck would not work if a huge amount of games weren't playable on it. After the failure of the original Steam machines, it would have been business suicide to launch the Steam Deck without the games people actually want to play. Proton as a compatibility layer is just the right choice, and I'm even now going to go back on what I just said only moments ago. Even with game developer support, if they made a native Linux build, eventually they will move on to something else and never update their old game again. And at some point, because of various reasons, the native build would end up breaking and then you're screwed. Proton, being the man in the middle, just removes that as an issue. Proton has multiple versions that you can go back through, so if it works on a specific version of Proton, you can just leave it pinned there to it. You don't push a platform by trying to force developers to support it directly with little return. You need a way to get people to it first, and that's what Proton is. A way to get users onto the likes of Steam Deck and desktop Linux, and once we have enough users to really make it properly worth it, and we're talking about something, frankly, a great many years away, only then does that native argument really make much sense against this bigger overall picture. Think about it, people have been using emulators and all sorts of different translation layers practically forever on PC at this point because they keep older things alive. Proton is really little different there, except that it has also enabled various AAA games, indies and everything in between playable at release. And when you think about it, games running through Proton are natively being run on your system, whether it is a Linux PC or Steam Deck. It's installed there locally. It's not running from some cloud. It's just the way it's being run is different. Now, I'll admit, I was in this weird little no tucks, no bucks native Linux version camp originally, concerned about what Proton meant for the future of gaming. Concerned about Microsoft's control and how Proton is going to be playing catch-up. But over time, Valve has proven repeatedly that Proton can do some serious magic, and in the end, I just want the games to work. Our time on Earth is limited. Why waste it worrying about what tech is behind the play button when it works? Haven't we all got better things to do with our time, like actually playing games? Looking back, we are now coming up on 5 years this August since Proton released. Initially, it only let a few select titles be played on desktop Linux. This was before Steam Deck was a thing. And now you can try using Proton to play anything, and even anti-cheat compatibility has been slowly improving. Thanks to Proton, I've been able to discover a ton of new favourite games, some I would never have been able to play before. From Deep Rock Galactic to God of War and everything in between, like the indie game Noita, that's a really cool one. Gamers who use Linux and Steam Deck specifically are now in a place where they can truly get excited alongside their friends or just anyone else who only uses Windows or say only has a traditional console. Because they know now there's a very high probable chance at release that whatever the new exciting thing coming out is will probably work without much trouble, likely even be just click and play. And if not, we've already seen that Valve can work very quickly to patch Proton for new releases. So for now, Proton is well and truly our only hope. At least that's what I think. This is just me thinking out loud and deciding to make a video after yet another game dropped native Linux support, because it's happened before and it will happen again. Let me know what you think of my thoughts here in the comments. Do you think Proton is the only way forward, or do you think differently? Let me know, and I'll see you later.